Hello, my name is Russell Swanson, and this is the 20th lecture in my 20-part lecture series on the history of ethics. And today I'm going to be finishing up with the 19th century figure, Friedrich Nietzsche. It might seem a little strange that I am finishing this lecture series on the history of ethics with a 19th century figure, somebody who dies in 1900, literally, the year 1900. Let me try to defend that choice just a little bit. And I'll defend it in two ways. If you've been following this lecture series, what I think you'll see when you look at 20th and 21st century work in ethics is largely a continuation of the four major theoretical perspectives that have been explored in this lecture series. You're going to see a continuation of social contractarianism, social contract theory of morality. You're going to see a continuation of Humean ethics. I think one of the interesting manifestations and twists on Humean ethics will be what becomes increasingly known as feminist ethics in the 20th century, which pulls strongly on this idea that it is our relatedness that generates our moral duties, in contrast to the Kantian position, which again continues throughout the 20th century to be refined and clarified and argued for and argued against. Feminist ethics in the 20th century says that this Kantian focus on the autonomous individual using reason to generate a kind of a detached perspective in order to find your universal principles that govern you and everybody else, that's missing something crucial, that we are related creatures and that many of our duties in life come out of the concrete relationships that we have fostered. Our ethical obligations follow many times from the relatedness that we engage in life, and that Kant's and others overstate our autonomy and they overstate the place of rationality in ethics many times. And so I think in some ways, and this is overly simple admittedly in a way, feminist ethics is very broad, but in some sense, I think that the Humean tradition from the 18th century allows for some understanding of what's going on within feminist ethics in the 20th century. And so, as I mentioned, you still also have the Kantian ethical perspective, and you still have the utilitarian ethical perspective. And then I think that what's added to that that's fairly unique, maybe in some sense, is the attempt to look for what do all these ethical perspectives share, which introduces an interesting metaphor, and that is that maybe what we want to do as 21st century or 20th, now 21st century ethical people is we want to build a kind of a toolkit of ethical frameworks, and we want to be able to pull out the appropriate framework to deal with certain kinds of moral dilemmas, and where possible we want to look at how different frameworks might lead us in a common direction in terms of the moral choices that we make. I think that's happening in the 20th and 21st century. But with that said, I think that most of what we see in the 20th and 21st centuries are continuations of these major theoretical frameworks developed earlier in the modern, and that the one really new voice added to the four major sort of moral theories of the modern are these, what I've characterized as postmodern thinkers and existential philosophers, who are going to talk about morality in a very different way, by sort of emphasizing a new set of challenges in terms of living well in the late 19th century and the 20th century and beyond, that are the result of sort of a postmodern context. And I think that I finished the lecture series here with Friedrich Nietzsche because in part I just think that, at least in my reading of Nietzsche, which I will offer you, my reading of Nietzsche today, Nietzsche still speaks to some of the fundamental challenge that we confront. He somewhat annoyingly said, in his writings that he was predicting the future of the next couple of hundred years. And I think in some ways, my sense of it, and again, I'm a bit of an apologist for Nietzsche, and I'll try to explain more what I mean by that. I think he was right. I think Nietzsche saw a lot about what was on the horizon and what had already unfolded, and we are still in many ways very much coming to grips with some of the things that he announced. And yes, he did announce them in ways that are troublesome and problematic sometimes. So let me also develop this idea that I'm a bit of an apologist for Nietzsche. Nietzsche is a notoriously difficult philosopher for a couple of reasons. One, he sort of eschews systematicity. He sort of tries to avoid being overly easy to systematize. In part, I think, charitably, that some of what he's doing is kind of like a Socrates or like a Kierkegaard. He is raising issues and challenging individuals to respond to those issues rather than trying to present a philosophy that everybody can then follow. The other thing about Nietzsche is that he is sort of not only sort of notoriously in his body of work as a whole, because there are certain books where he's much more systematic, but in his body of work as a whole, you know, there's this tendency to sort of overstate and to use sort of exaggerated, we might call it romantic language, over the top, sort of hyperbolic, sublime references that are, you know, admittedly sometimes designed to offend. And I think I've said in an earlier lecture, but I'll repeat here, that I think in many respects, Nietzsche is one of those people that believes that many of us probably need to be shocked awake to existence and the challenge of existence, that many of us sort of sleepwalk our way through lives. And so Nietzsche gets himself into some trouble with some language that's sort of over the top and hyperbolic. And I try to soften that and defend Nietzsche and pull out what I think is most valuable and important in his thinking and offer you a not completely unique. I'm very, you know, again, standing on the shoulders of giants, very dependent upon, you know, many thinkers, you know, Walter Kaufmann and others who have done so much incredible scholarship on the texts of Nietzsche that, you know, I'm crawling up on the top of the secondary literature to offer you what I hope will be a kind of accessible account, you know, and that's one of the things I see as my specialty, is to try to make these ideas accessible to people in ways that are meaningful, so that we don't just keep philosophy in the ivory tower, but that we bring it out and we democratize it and we allow the Socratic promise of philosophy to be fulfilled by more of us wrestling with it in meaningful ways. And so one more, you know, comment before I dive into more specifics about Nietzsche in particular, sort of by way of preface. You know, because of this tendency that Nietzsche had to, in the body of work as a whole, to not be overly concerned with systematicity and to be sort of hyperbolic and metaphorical in his sort of exaggerated metaphors at time. He was also, I think, unfortunately, easily appropriated by some thinkers and traditions that really, I would argue, have no business appropriating that. And I just want to deal with this kind of right up front. The Germans in the early 20th century, and then the Nazis in particular by the 30s and 40s, very much tried to appropriate Nietzsche as sort of the philosopher of the German people, never mind that he was this, you know, brunette, you know, guy, not a blonde, you know, Aryan German. You know, neither was Hitler, right? But they tried to appropriate him as sort of the philosopher of strength and the philosopher of domination and the philosopher of higher people. And every one of those little references that I made, unfortunately, Nietzsche's language is such that it lent itself to that appropriation. However, I'm just going to very briefly tell you why I think that's a huge mistake. Nietzsche is ultimately calling out the best and strongest individuals among us to the challenge of this historical moment. And when you look at what specifically Nazism represented as a over-fascist philosophy in which the state and the Germanic nation sort of trumped all concerns with over the individual. You know, there's just, while there's language that got appropriated and for understandable reasons there, you know, like Nietzsche said at some point that the blonde beast would run throughout Europe and that blood would run in the streets and tens of thousands of people would have to die. You know, in some sense, I think what he was doing was literally predicting the way in which the crisis of the 19th and 20th century in terms of the postmodern crisis that I've kind of built a sense for in the earlier lectures, you know, is going to produce an awful lot of trouble and is going to produce this nationalism and is going to produce this conflict and this war that is going to rage at a higher level than ever before. But that's not because I think Nietzsche was advocating for that. I think Nietzsche is a champion of the individual, and that's going to be my reading of him. And if that's the case, which I think is a very reasonable reading of Nietzsche, then Nietzsche in defense of fascism is ironically wrong. And, you know, part of how Nietzsche got appropriated by the fascists was by his own sister. You know, Nietzsche, as I'll spell out for you, went a little crazy, went very crazy by the end of his life for a variety of reasons, maybe, and went under the care of his sister. And his sister then increasingly became sympathetic to the sort of imperialist side of German political philosophy and eventually with Nazism itself. And so his sister, as A, caretaker of Nietzsche's estate, and B, sympathetic to the Nazis, she like literally sold out Nietzsche's estate and writing to the Nazis. I think at one point you can find a picture online of Nietzsche's sister giving Nietzsche's walking stick to Hitler or something like that explicitly, right? So again, I just wanted to deal with that kind of up front because I think that while, excuse me, admittedly Nietzsche's language is hyperbolic and exaggerated and disturbing at times and offensive to almost anybody at times. I mean, he's just an equal opportunity offender, right? Because he just thinks all of us could use this smack in order to be shocked awake to the challenge of existence. I think it's a huge mistake to associate Nietzsche with Nazism in particular. Now, so with that said, let me give you a little sense for the life of Nietzsche and how his work develops out of that. Nietzsche was raised in a very religious Lutheran family. His father was a pastor and a scholar within Lutheran Christianity. And everybody thought that Nietzsche was going to go on to sort of follow his father in this, but his father died when Nietzsche was very young, which was tragic. And then he was raised by all of these female members of his family, which may go some way to explain some of the problems that Nietzsche seems to have with women later in his life, in his writings, which are unfortunate. And again, I just don't think that any kind of sexism in Nietzsche represents anything like the best of Nietzsche. And so I apologize for Nietzsche and move beyond it, looking for the best in his work charitably. And so Nietzsche then goes on to study at the university, and he has kind of a mixed experience at first where he's a little disillusioned about what's going on in college, but eventually becomes a very, very able student. And he very quickly sort of loses focus narrowly on Lutheran Christianity. And because of his vast capacity as a student, just becomes fascinated kind of globally with culture, with literature, with mythology, with religion, and with philosophy. And eventually gets sort of fascinated by the field of philology, which is primarily the study of ancient languages, but it's also the study of ancient languages so that one can study, ancient written traditions. And very quickly, as Nietzsche sort of moves through the ranks as a student, he ends up studying with some of the top minds in the field of philology. And, what we're told about this is that he was kind of like a rock star, even as a graduate student. Even his professors recognized that he had this incredible combination of intellectual abilities, linguistic abilities, memory, so he had this opportunity to read texts in original languages from different traditions, and then memory to hold on to that, and then a capacity to synthesize based on what he's remembering, a kind of a rare combination. He's kind of an elite, like an elite athlete, combines certain things at a very high. He's an elite thinker, and I think that shows up early in his life. And so supposedly, even before he finishes his doctoral degree or the equivalent of that in one of the toughest educational systems on the planet at that time, the German educational system, he ends up being pulled away to become a professor even before he finishes his graduate school work at a very prestigious university in Switzerland, in Basel, Switzerland. And, one way I think about this is, imagine being like a medical student, and before you even finish medical school, all the hospitals in the world are just saying, hey, don't worry about finishing. I mean, when I say all the top hospitals in the world are saying, don't worry about finishing, just come do your research at our institution. It was almost unheard of at the time. But from there, things really began to turn, because when Nietzsche went from student to professor, a couple of things went south, and he didn't lecture well, and he didn't mingle well with his peers. And, some of this could have been, here's the charitable take on it. Nietzsche was maybe one of those people that was so smart that he just had a hard time fitting in. It also probably led to some arrogance, on his part, that caused him challenge. He probably didn't, take well to trying to simplify ideas for people beginning in their studies. And I think that he would have seen even a lot of his colleagues as just not up to thinking about things in the way that he had. So his career actually as an intellectual didn't go well. But with that said, he ends up producing a body of work that is pretty amazing and has found its way into the canon of Western philosophy. I say pretty amazing in part because, he was born in 1844, I think, and he died in 1900, and he went crazy and lost his mind by the time, probably around 1890 or so. And so within a very short amount of time, roughly, what's that? That's less than 50 years. He managed to produce a body of writing that to this day is really rich, and I think you'll find produce some ideas that are at the very least very provocative. And he did this with a lot of health problems that manifested in his life, and so he did this sort of traveling around looking for climates that helped him with his health, and writing these books that were really kind of like shockingly revolutionary for their time, and so they were not well received either, which is a little bit of a shame. But by the time that he dies in 1900, you're going to start to see people look at this body of work and say, oh, there's something to wrestle with here. And so, that's going to be sort of my preface for saying, look, give Nietzsche a chance. His language is often sort of almost purposefully offensive and hyperbolic and exaggerated, and he's infamously tough on some religious ideas. But I want you to understand that he's very symbolic, I think, in what he's talking about. There's an underlying meaning here, and his underlying meaning is almost always worth at least wrestling with. And so from there, I want to jump in and just say that if I'll try to present a kind of a series of the biggest ideas that I think are relevant to exploring Nietzsche in this lecture series in terms of his attitude towards living well in this moment. Nietzsche, as much as anybody, maybe does a lot to sort of launch what I've called in my earlier lectures this postmodern movement in philosophy, where we go beyond searching for overarching themes and overarching philosophies of existence to more sort of a focus on the process of being an individual living in a moment where we may never find overarching theories of reality or overarching theories of morality or any overarching lasting theories at all. And so Nietzsche, one place I think to start is to say that that he was this great scholar of ancient cultures and languages. And so he had this kind of capacity to take a big view and look for patterns in cultural productions and bodies of writing. And so he does just that, and he produces this dichotomy between two perspectives on life that he calls the master and slave moralities. Okay, let me flesh this out a little bit. What I think he's saying here is that when you look at the texts and the literature that reflect the value systems of cultures, let's say over the last 3,000 years or so, since the advent of complex writing, what you're going to find, surprise, surprise, is that there tend to be two very different attitudes towards existence that, again, surprise, surprise, that are correlate to the small ruling elite, the haves, the masters, as Nietzsche calls them, and the large ruled masses, the slaves or the have-nots. Again, depending on how much sociology you've done or economic history you've done, I think it's a general truism to say that for the most part over the last few thousand years, complex societies in particular were largely divided into a set of fairly stable elites and a set of people without economic, social, and political power, and no hope really of ever getting it. That you're sort of born into one of these positions and that you're going to be in those positions. And so this is what I'm going to call the positions of the haves or the have-nots, the position of the masters, and the position of the slaves. It's really fairly new, like in the Renaissance in particular, and then in the late modern age or 20th century in particular, in certain industrialized societies, that we really see an experiment with something in between the haves and have-nots in the form of a middle class. But what Nietzsche is picking up on in the literary traditions and the writings broadly about values within human culture is that what you're going to see generally is two perspectives reflected. And that, the story is actually a little bit more complex than that, because within any cultural tradition, Nietzsche, what he sees is a blend or a balance of these two perspectives, the master perspective and the slave perspective. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what he identifies as characteristic of the master morality, the master perspective, or the slave morality, the slave perspective. So the master moralities, the value systems of the masters of history, are the value systems of the people who have had, almost by birthright usually, economic, social, political power. And if you had economic, social, political power usually combined into one powerful set of institutions, then you tended to have a certain outlook on life that was what Nietzsche would call life-affirming and self-affirming, okay? And here's one way to see what he means by that. If you were in a position of power, then you would be more inclined to think that this life where you had power mattered. It was life-affirming. And you would also tend to think that you matter, right? Because you have power. It would be self-affirming. So you would think this life matters and you matter, and what specifically, let's put them together, what you do in this life matters. Okay, so master morality is life-affirming in this way, and it is self-affirming in this way. And now let's contrast that with slave moralities, which Nietzsche has this kind of interesting psychological claim that he makes about the slave moralities, where he says, look, the slave moralities tend to be life-denying and self-denying. Okay, and that sounds really strange, especially the self-denying part, but here's how Nietzsche spells that out. He says, slave moralities tend to be associated with metaphysics, pictures of reality that suggest this level of reality is somehow not the most important level of reality. And then secondly, slave moralities tend to be associated with a value structure that says this self, even myself, is not important and not valuable, and that I'm successful to the extent that I get over belief in myself. Okay, and let me be a little bit more specific there. Slave moralities are life-denying and self-denying in the sense that they tend to champion other levels of existence instead of this one, and they tend to say that your ticket to other levels of existence is stamped, right, to the extent that you admit that you are kind of a lowly, imperfect, broken creature. So it's self-denying in that regard. And Nietzsche's psychological argument's an interesting one here. He says that this value structure is in some ways a kind of a psychological defense mechanism. If you lack social, political, and economic power, and you live in a cultural context in which you will never have any power like that, then what you're going to do in order to survive the crushing oppression of total lack of power with no recourse to ever have any, is you're going to define power in this lifetime as wrong, and you're going to define weakness, the devaluation of this life and the celebration of your own powerlessness, as virtue. It's born out of, he says, a kind of a resentment of power. And this is one reason why he's very critical of slave moralities eventually, even though in some sense he's saying this is kind of a clever psychological defense mechanism. If you don't have power, the move you're going to make is you're going to define power as wrong, and you're going to define weakness as right. And if you're never going to have power in this lifetime, then you're going to embrace metaphysical pictures of reality that devalue this life where you are powerless and champion other ways of existing, perhaps other levels of existence in which you will actually be rewarded for your powerlessness and your humility and your meekness. So again, what Nietzsche thinks is that in the history of human civilizations, you often see a kind of I'll say is a healthy balance of the value system blending, a mix of the blending of how much we champion in this society sort of master values and how much we champion slave values in the society. You might think of that like literally as how many people are in this, think of life this way, and how many people think of this life this way. And the trouble is, Nietzsche says, and here's where we get to his diagnosis of the moment, is he says that modernity is an illness. Okay, and what he means by that is that the late modern period of the 19th century, what I've characterized as sort of the precursor to the postmodern, is a cultural, and he's talking here about like sort of Northern European, Western civilization. He's saying the cultural lens that we live through in this moment that he's living, late 19th century, has become pathologically infected by slave morality. Okay, and he's actually got, again, a kind of a very provocative analysis of this where he's going to be very harsh on the Judeo-Christian tradition. But again, try to keep your ears open as I say that, because what he means by that is that there was, by all accounts, a very radical individual in ancient Roman occupied Judea who rebelled against the power structure of the day, named Jesus. But what happened over time is that the radical critique offered by Jesus got turned into a slave morality in the sense that it became life and self-denying in one particular interpretation of it. And I think Nietzsche would even say that there were some sort of wolves in sheep's clothing who managed to appropriate the fairly radical critique offered by Jesus and turn it into a life-denying and self-denying philosophy to sell to the masses, ironically, in order to maintain elite power structures. Now, again, that might sound like a fairly cynical reading on the history of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Depending on your perspective, it might sound uncharitable and unfair. again, I'll get to it later on. I'm going to be an apologist for Nietzsche. I'm going to talk about ways in which I think actually you can make sense for a kind of a Kierkegaardian Christianity that goes forth even in light of this critique of institutionalized Christianity. But what Nietzsche's trying to do, right, is diagnose what he thinks is wrong with his culture in some kind of Socratic way. You know, and Nietzsche has this kind of begrudging admiration for Socrates. He's got problems with Socrates, especially the Socrates that Plato gives us. But he's got this begrudging Socrates for Socrates as an individual who's engaged intensely in critique and leads this legacy of critique that most people just, including most philosophers, don't really appreciate. And Nietzsche's here to sort of take to the next level. He says, look, if we're going to engage in this serious critique, what we need to do is talk about the ways in which our culture is broken. And our culture is broken in crucial ways in this moment. And it's a sort of a combination of factors. One, the typical balance between master moralities and slave moralities, between the sort of ways of looking of life of leaders and the ways of looking at life of followers, is out of balance in this moment because certain cynical leaders have taken this slave morality too far. It was too conveniently used in order to gather power for certain leaders. And because of that, in some sense, the life-denying and self-denying moralities of this one, again, interpretation of the life of Jesus have become so widespread that it's crippling culture. And what I think Nietzsche means by this idea of sort of crippling culture is that when slave moralities become sort of overrepresented in the value system of any moment of history, what's going to happen is that through this self-denying, life-denying propensity, too many people are going to neglect the development of their own traits and capacities in this lifetime to improve this lifetime by developing themselves. And so in some sense, the overabundance of slave morality in this moment that he's diagnosing leads to a failure of culture to produce the kind of innovators and problem solvers that might help culture evolve. And so Nietzsche is predicting, in some sense, cultural collapse. And again, he's not, like famously, the great German philosopher Hegel that I mentioned briefly in my earlier lecture, had this kind of end of history philosophy where it was all moving towards progress. And that gets overturned by somebody like Kierkegaard and overturned by somebody like Arthur Schopenhauer, who would say that there's no necessary progress to history. What there is just sort of a blind, purposeless will to survive that just tries to continue itself. And Nietzsche is influenced actually by Schopenhauer in some respects. So he doesn't believe that there's any necessary future ahead of us, not a good one, not a bad one. What he's trying to say is we're just in trouble in this moment because the value system of this moment has been over-infected, over-represented by slave moralities. And as such, we're no longer encouraging people in a sort of a wide enough cultural experiment to work on themselves and believe in themselves, and then to use those abilities to work on this lifetime, right? It's as if, imagine too many people focus on their dream home and their plans for their dream home. Meanwhile, their homes and the neighborhoods that those homes are a part of aren't getting enough of their energy. And Nietzsche's saying that kind of otherworldly, life-denying focus, has a place in society in balance. But if it becomes overrepresented, we just neglect our neighborhoods and our homes and ourselves to such an extent that we're not going to continue to put the energy into upkeep that is required to keep culture going. And so this illness that he's diagnosing is a kind of a recipe for cultural collapse, cultural decline, and perhaps even species decline if the experiment becomes too broad. And so he says the response to this moment is for people to take philosophical critique to another level, which he metaphorically characterizes as philosophy with a hammer. Now, this is typical Nietzsche. It's metaphorical, it's poetic, and it's kind of over the top, but it's not enough to do philosophy with a pen. You need to learn to wield philosophy like a hammer. And if we sort of extend out this metaphor that he's developing here, it's as if the value system of our culture is represented by a series of iconic statues. And actually, this is pretty apt for this moment in which I'm recording this lecture. Imagine there are statues that represent the value system of the culture. And what Nietzsche says you need to be willing to do in order to let culture evolve beyond itself is you need to wield your hammer as hard as you can at these statues, because metaphorically speaking, if they are solid, then they will withstand the strength of that critique, that attack. He calls this in places naysaying. You need to be willing to engage in naysaying, right? You need to be willing to engage in powerful attack and critique, both at the individual level and at the cultural level. If these statues that represent the value system of society are hollow or superficial, or they become fragile because they're outdated, when you hit them with the attack, the critique, the hammer, they will be smashed. And they should be smashed, Nietzsche says, because naysaying, wielding the hammer, philosophical critique in the most aggressive sense of the term, is what's required to clear the temple, to clear the pantheon, to clear the field in order to make way for new values for a new time. And so if we're not wielding the hammer, then we are not setting up the possibility of progress. Okay, and so the problem here is that, you know, because society is overly infected with a slave morality, there are too many people sort of living in a herd, as humans have often done, all too willing to embrace totally speculative metaphysical schema, which is the human tendency historically. And they are unwilling to embrace what Nietzsche characterizes as their true biological nature, their will to power. Now, this is a very controversial Nietzschean notion in which there's a lot of different interpretations, but here's my reading of it. Nietzsche, as I mentioned, was influenced by the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer had this critique of Hegel in particular. Schopenhauer said there's no guarantee we're moving forward in history. Nietzsche agrees with that. Schopenhauer argued that history is not motivated by some kind of underlying intelligence or rationality. Instead, Schopenhauer argued that it would be more honest to think that life is motivated by some kind of irrational, unidentifiable force. Call it life, call it the will to life, the will to live, that simply mysteriously tries to perpetuate itself, and there doesn't seem to be some end goal in mind. Now, when Nietzsche reads this in Schopenhauer, he really gets his world rocked. I think that in some sense, Nietzsche believes that Schopenhauer is being more honest about the modern crisis than anybody else he's reading. But with that said, Nietzsche ends up concluding that Schopenhauer's characterization of life as the blind, purposeless will to live, he characterized it as bourgeois and weak, right? And what he's saying is that Schopenhauer is, in some sense, and I think this is fair as a critique of Schopenhauer is saying that when you see that life is purposeless, and it's just a mysterious force trying to perpetuate itself, the thing you should do, according to Schopenhauer, is that you should embrace some kind of almost ascetic renunciation of desire, self-denying renunciation of desire. And again, Nietzsche's going to see that self-denying. He's going, that's weak, that you're giving up. But what Schopenhauer is arguing is that you need to let go of the way in which you are being sort of used by the life that courses through you. Again, it's often referred to as a cynical, pessimistic philosophy. Schopenhauer's philosophy is very pessimistic. He's sort of the dark champion of pessimism in many respects. But what Schopenhauer is saying is that you need to give up on what unfortunately just manifests for many individuals as sort of wanting, getting, wanting, getting, wanting, getting toward no good end. And so you need to try to give up on wanting and desire in order to not be a victim of this purposeless will to life or will to live. And Nietzsche says, actually, this is where Schopenhauer was himself, showing himself to be too bourgeois, too comfortable, too quick to give up, too perhaps infected by slave morality himself. He was soft in the belly and he didn't have the stomach for the fight, because if he would have had the stomach for the fight, he would have had the stomach to go beyond his good insight that we don't know of any ultimate purpose for existence, and say that what characterizes life itself is not a blind attempt to just stay alive, will to live, but a will to overcome itself, a will to power. Again, here's one of those concepts that the Nazis appropriated as a kind of a will to dominate others. Again, Nietzsche's language, I think, sets him up for this, but I just think that's the wrong way to take it, and certainly not the most useful way to take it in terms of pulling something provocative and worthy of thought out of it. For me, the will to power is best understood as some kind of drive to become more powerful than you have been before. Because if you are no longer striving to become more powerful than you have been before, you're going to die. If you're not embracing this sort of continuous sort of hunger to be more than you have been, you will die and become weak. That's just, and in some sense, I think that Nietzsche is kind of couching himself with a kind of a claim about nature here, at least a poetic version of it that is useful for the rest of his project here, and encouraging us to become more than we have been before. And so that's my reading of the will to power. That the trouble with the will to power, as it would manifest in this moment, is that it would cause us to bring out the hammer. It would cause us to swing the hammer against the icons of culture and to painfully disillusion ourselves. Think about that second move in the allegory of the cave of Plato that we looked at so long ago. And we would find that some of the things that we've been leaning into to give our lives meaning are shadows. They're superficial, they're hollow, or they're archaic and old and fragile, and they need to be smashed. And again, the trouble is that in this moment, there is a particularly historically large tragedy looming as we wield the hammer in this moment. And in some sense, Nietzsche says, look, this has really already happened. And he describes this as the death of God. Now, again, the language here is over the top, it's metaphorical. So let's, for a second, just for the sake of seeing if there's anything worth wrestling with here, unpack the possible interpretations we might yield to the death of God. Nietzsche says that, since Copernicus, and, those of you following this lecture series, you should see the modern crisis and the Copernican revolution is kind of an important moment that Nietzsche's very self-consciously drawing forth here. He's saying that since Copernicus, we've been spinning from the center towards X. Okay, what does it mean? Well, look, since we removed ourselves from the center of the universe, we have been continually showing ourselves that we don't know how to orient ourselves in the universe anymore. And that's sort of a astronomical metaphor, just like I used it in my lecture on the modern crisis in ethics, for we're having increasing difficulty placing ourselves in relation to reality and placing ourselves in relation to history. As he goes on to say, we don't know the direction of up anymore. What is up in this universe anymore? What is forward in this universe anymore? And we feel increasingly the sort of cold breath of deep space on the back of our neck. And the more we peer into this deep abyss of deep space the smaller we see ourselves becoming, right? And the less we know with any certainty of our guaranteed purpose in existence. And so in some respects, what he's saying is that the death of God is a sort of a symbol for the death of certainty about truth and about purpose. And again, we could unpack this, and I think we probably should. In some sense, maybe more literally, we could say that, you know, Genesis, which is an important document in all of the Abrahamic religions in terms of that creation narrative, which orients us in relation to the creative source of existence and with regard to existence. That's important in all the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And what has modern science, modern cosmology and astronomy and evolutionary biology done to that? Well, look, again, without trying to be disrespectful, it has problematized a literal translation of Genesis, right? I mean, to imagine that we were created in our anatomically modern form at the very beginning of creation, and our form somehow, not maybe physically, but even spiritually, you know, necessarily echoes the form of the creative source of existence itself. You know, to take that too literally in this moment is to adhere to something that Nietzsche is claiming is, you know, from a bygone epoch. Okay, so there's just no, I can't sort of dance around that as much as I want to apologize for Nietzsche. I will go on to say that I do think that something like a Kierkegaardian leap of faith is still in ways consistent with this realization. However, you know, Nietzsche's saying you just can't be a believer in Genesis in the 19th and 20th and now 21st century in the way that you could have been in the 14th century. And the reason for that is ironically because given the human will to power, we are always somewhat unconsciously drawn towards trying to overcome ourselves. This is not, again, dominance over others. The highest expression of the will to power is sort of, you know, mastery of yourself. But think about this in terms of our species. If we are a species and a life form, like all life forms may be characterized by this need to sort of evolve or die, that in some sense that's manifested in humans as the creation of science and the generation of all these very increasingly powerful scientific theories, which, yes, have collided with and undercut. I mean, let's just talk about the Inquisition as a moment where church authorities, you know, brought somebody like Galileo before them to condemn him for teaching these as if these were true, you know, the heliocentric model as if it were true. And setting aside the complexities of that story for a moment, you know, this is Nietzsche's just saying, look, we can't have any more inquisitions like that based on that version of reality. It's just untenable. We have to move forward. Now, again, as an apologist of Nietzsche, I would say that Genesis remains, frankly, even more rich and meaningful when taken not literally but symbolically. And frankly, when you take it that way, you can maybe even understand why it's been so powerful when taken literally by people historically. And again, I'm not trying to infringe on anybody's rights here to believe whatever you want to believe as an individual. This is definitely a lecture that talks about, you know, how you got to do you in this moment of history. But this is Nietzsche's point, and that is that if you're going to do you in this moment of history, you need to be able to wield the hammer. And as a culture, we need to be able to wield the hammer in Western civilization. And if we hold on to beliefs that are no longer tenable, it's going to drag us down. And so, again, the problem, and Nietzsche very much sees that this is problematic, right? This is tragic in a way. He is in some ways sort of bombastic. In his great work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra from, I think, 1885 or so, very metaphorical, allegorical book in which he has Zoroaster reconceived as Zarathustra, which is, if you don't know much about religious history, Zoroaster is like one of the original prophets of a great sort of monotheistic, diabolical notion of good and evil, right? And so Zoroaster comes forth and promotes this sort of, some would say, it, original vision of one great good against one great evil. Ahura Mazda versus Ahriman, I think, if I have those Persian concepts right, and who knows if I'm pronouncing them right, but it's Zoroaster who maybe first within human culture announces this sort of one great good against one great evil. And Nietzsche, in his sort of poetic genius, says, I'm going to have Zoroaster come back as Zarathustra, which I think is just another rendering of Zoroaster. And I'm going to have Zarathustra, come back down the mountain and, like almost like a raving mad person, right, announce the end of the overly simple dichotomy of one great good versus one great evil, and announce a kind of a time to evolve beyond the overly simple black and white characterizations of history. You know, another work which expands on this in a more systematic way is his work titled Beyond Good and Evil, right? And I don't think that means that Nietzsche is against positing value systems. That's my interpretation I'm going to give you. I don't think that's accurate. But he certainly got his own take on how we should posit value systems to live by. And they're not going to be these sort of all or none, black or white, monotheistic, literal interpretations that he thinks has just been undercut. And again, the poetic language here is again, I'll give it to you in part because just to make the point of how Nietzsche can be so upsetting, is he says that not only God is dead, but he says we have murdered him. And I think he has literally a madman rush into the marketplace, right, into the center of economic power, that same place that got Socrates in trouble. And at the market, the madman, looks for God. And he says, where's God? And everybody's like, kind of laughing at this crazy dude. And he says that the madman looks for God and doesn't find him. And he says to the people that are gathering around, I don't find him because we have killed him. Okay. Again, he says, we are the murderers of God. Now, again, the language is bombastic and iconoclastic, and it's meant to shock, but let's unpack it. We, with our own will to power, developed our own scientific theories, and as much as they can be made consistent with kind of evolved notions and individualistic notions of faith, you can say things like, and what causes the Big Bang? Well, that must be the big mystery called God. But conceptions of the divine that came before, they just don't survive this moment intact, right? Unchallenged. And so, what he's saying here with the death of God and calling us out as the murderers of God is not celebratory. He knows it's a tragedy, but what he's saying is that the human attempt to conceptualize the great mystery of existence produces these concepts of divinity that themselves age and die. Where are the Greek gods? Where are the Egyptian gods? Where are the Roman gods? Where are the previous conceptions of the higher levels of reality? Gods, too, they die and they decompose even, he says. And this is, again, the language, the metaphor, is he says, people are acting as if they don't yet smell the decomposing corpse of this particular conception of the divine. Again, I'm almost sorry to bring that language in, but, I got to be honest, Nietzsche's, I think, trying to shock in some ways with that kind of extended metaphor here. But he said, and this is why, right, we don't want to wield the hammer. Because if we continue to embrace our will to power and try to become more than we have been before, we are going to see that we live in a kind of a tragic, historically tragic moment where not only is a particular conception of the divine and a certain set of institutions being challenged, We live in the moment, and this is what I think foreshadows the postmodern, where because we have seen this in the historical order, the Egyptian gods disappear, the Greek gods disappear, the Roman gods disappear, and the Judeo-Christian, the Abrahamic conception of God takes blows in the modern, that we live in the era where we see that no one conception of the divine, no one characterization of the great mysterious cause of all existence, no one human attempt to generate a sense of purpose and significance is ever going to serve us forever. And so the death of God becomes symbolic not just for this very specific historical critique of the Judeo-Christian and Abrahamic traditions, but a broader philosophical critique of the metaphysical and speculative tendencies of human beings since their, almost since they come out of the dark well of prehistory as hunters and gatherers, to try to find these coherent accounts of existence that also give us direction. We live in let me put it this way, we have the kind of responsibility and the burden of living in the moment of history where humanity has come to grips with how humanity overturns itself. And when we do that in an honest way, we peer into the nihilistic abyss. We peer into, and this is the tragedy of wielding the hammer in this moment of history for Nietzsche. We live in the moment where when we wield the hammer, we don't just disrupt current conceptions of divine and purpose and current value structures. Maybe it's even things like consumeristic capitalism in the late 20th century. Maybe it's, the way in which certain political institutions are functioning or not functioning for us. We live in a moment where we're not only critiquing specific historical manifestations of our value system, we live in a moment where we're seeing that the challenge will never end. And that is daunting. That's, back to the sort of anxiety and despair and uncertainty of that. We peer into what Nietzsche characterizes as nihilism. And sort of at the deepest level, nihilism comes from this root nihil, meaning nothing in Latin. And it means that we have what I would characterize in this postmodern moment, we have exposed the deep abyss, right? We have, here's a weird connection, but I once came across a comic in the Calvin and Hobbes comic strip, and it wasn't very funny. And I thought it was really odd and significant for that reason. And if I recall it, it basically has the little boy, Calvin, all by himself in this, no dolls coming to life in this one. And he's peering into space on the sort of curved horizon of the earth. And, on the one hand, it's kind of beautiful. On the other hand, if you know how this term is used in sort of the history of art, it is sublime, right? It's awesome, and it's overwhelmingly awesome in a way. And so Calvin, in the second box of this comic, shouts out, "I'm significant." And I want you to think about that, right? He's staring at deep space, and then he shouts out, "I'm significant." What we might call, like reaction formation, if I'm using that word correctly from sort of depth psychological perspectives. It is, in some sense, the very fact that Calvin feels insignificant in that moment that causes him to shout. And what does he get back in the third box of these 4 boxes in this comic strip? Nothing. There's not even the "no, you're not," right? I mean, there's just nothing, right? And here's my connection to this Nietzschean point of peering into nihilism. We live in the moment where it is just harder than ever before in history to avoid peering into the abyss of nothingness. And what I mean by that is the possibility that we are like Sisyphus and that we are rolling a rock up the hill and that the rock's just going to roll back down and entropy is going to win. And this is never going to amount to anything. And that's a terrifying experience, you know. And so what's interesting to me about Nietzsche, right, is that he criticized Schopenhauer for having given up pessimistically. And so to his credit, Nietzsche, who struggles throughout almost his entire adult life with debilitating illness, and then loses his mind, you know, when he's like, you know, very young, and not even 30, I think, if I'm doing them, you know, 40 something maybe. And you know, he's losing his mind and seeing this unfold, and despite and struggling with illness, and he can't pursue his career where he's this incredible scholar, and yet he still is going to find a way, as I said it in an earlier lecture, through this anxiety and despair. And his version of that goes like this. See, most people in the herd, most people are sheeple. We've evolved to be sheeple. Most people in the herd cling to this kind of metaphysical impulse to embrace some coherent account of existence that gives their lives structure. But the metaphysical impulse is combined with this tendency to see that the narrative that we give ourselves to give our life meaning is from outside of ourselves, and that it thus has this stamp of somehow external rightness or correctness, or it has this factual basis to it. And Nietzsche is saying in his proclamation of the death of God that we live in the moment where we can no longer, with the same sort of seriousness, imagine that any one narrative that we generate, any value system that we choose to live by, is going to have that stamp of factuality given to it, you know, of reality given to it. We still have this impulse to create, but we live in the moment where, you know, wielding the will to power is almost unconsciously undercut, you know, our conception of the divine, and given us this perspective over how, you know, conceptions of the divine and conceptions of purpose and value structures almost always have to be overcome, and that they have historically, and that they probably will going forward. And because we live in this moment where we see the sort of never-ending, the infinite depth of the abyss, right? The never-ending nature of this task, and the sort of way in which, as I said in this comic, you know, we don't get any answer from the abyss itself. We're going to have to bring ourselves out of this ourselves. You know, like, we're going to have to lift ourselves out of this. And most people, frankly, can't even wield the hammer, right? Most people can't take up the Socratic quest, as I've used that term in this lecture series, and critique their own value structure and that of their society in order to make their life their own through an examined existence. This is still, philosophy, a rare and recent experiment. One which I think has all the promise in the world to make democracy more interesting, but one which the jury is out on. Sorry, Plato is right. The jury's out. Are we up to it? I don't know. I'm committing my life to it, but I don't know. And, you know, and this is Nietzsche's way, I think, of talking about that same question. Most people can't even look honestly at the tragedy of this moment of history. But even of those who can, most of them are broken by that. And what I mean by that is, as Nietzsche says, that they become passive in the face of nihilism. If people can become honest enough to look into this abyss and this potential meaninglessness in some kind of ultimate, final, absolute, once and for all sense, if they look into this abyss, most of them, the abyss looks back at them, as Nietzsche would say, and they're just sort of sucked in. And they see no reason to go on, and they are pulled into this paralyzing despair of to be or not to be, suicidal despair. And, you know, they may give up, and there's a lot of different ways to give up, right? You know, you might end up just watching an awful lot of Netflix and taking too many painkillers. You know, and I'm not saying that to make light of that at all, right? That's tragic and it's all too real, I think. We might look at this challenge and sort of, let's translate it into this moment in another way and see the immensity of this challenge of trying to assert some values into existence, into this void, and struggle to manifest these values more broadly in society, and see the immensity of it, and just become, like, let's say, politically paralyzed and socially inactive, and see no reason to contribute to the improvement of our society. And I think all of this, from the extreme of suicidal despair all the way to, you know, political and social apathy, are ways of, and addiction, right, behaviors, are ways of seeing how too many people are overcome by glimpses of the moment that they live in, and overcome by the existential anxiety and despair of this moment, and broken by it and become passive. But what Nietzsche says, and this is something that I think is worth, you know, makes it sort of almost all worth it to wrestle with this, is that what Nietzsche says we need to do in this moment is embrace our will to power, embrace the tragedy of having to wield the hammer in this moment, and try to yet again overcome ourselves. And yet again overcome the death of God. This will be historically significant, because what will it mean? Well, here's where I want to become ironically apologetic for Nietzsche, because I think this is consistent with Nietzsche, and of course his sort of desire to kick out at the religious institutions of his time, I think in some ways kept him from seeing this. But in some sense, what Nietzsche wants us to do is to become active in the face of nihilism, to engage in yay-saying in addition to naysaying. Naysaying is crucial. You have to learn to say no, but you can't live there. You can't live in the abyss. You can't live in the critique. You can't live in saying no to things. You have to find things to say yes to. And you will, in this moment, if you're honest, realize that you'll never get the ultimate stamp of approval that we used to think we had, because no value structure is likely to be the end-all be-all value structure. No value structure is somehow going to be the real one. And yet, if you can look at that honestly, and say yes to some things, and we need to talk about, you know, how do we generate these yeses? Well, ironically, I would say, in a way that I think is consistent with Nietzsche, you need to take the real underlying symbolic meaning of having the spark of the divine within you and embrace your full creative potential and author your own existence. Nietzsche talks about this another way that's helpful, I think, and that is that the nihilistic abyss manifests itself as a kind of a blank canvas, that when we wield the hammer against the value structures of our time, we may find that we live in a moment of such significant transformation that the canvas is just blank now. And that might paralyze us, but we can also see in the blank canvas the opportunity to paint our vision. You know, think about like a Vincent van Gogh or a Frida Kahlo or one of these famously unique artists who in many respects were maybe not appreciated in their lifetimes the way that the history of art comes back to them. Especially, I think this is true of Van Gogh, right? Like, he sold nothing. If he sold anything, he might have sold a couple things to his brother when he was starving. But he sold nothing. But eventually, paintings you guys all know, right? Like the Starry Night becomes at one point the most expensive painting in history. Now, I almost feel bad appealing to the cost of art to make this point, because, you know, the whole art world and the business of art is tragic in many respects for undercutting some of the most powerful goals of art, I would say. But with that said, my point here is that nobody got Van Gogh's vision, but that didn't stop him, and he kept painting it. Nobody appreciated it but him, but he did it anyway. And eventually we caught up with him, and eventually art moved through him, right? Like the history of creative self-expression moved through Van Gogh. He wasn't around to see it, and that's tragic. But the way in which I think this is relevant to Nietzsche, right, is that we have to be like Van Gogh. We have to stop asking the market what it wants from us. We have to stop asking Instagram what it wants from us in order to get more followers. We need to stop asking the world what it wants from us in order to not find us offensive or problematic. And we need to be willing to paint our own vision of life in this moment. And if we, and again, Nietzsche is kind of elitist, like Plato was elitist. He thought he was speaking to a few in the way that that Plato thought that, there would only be a small subset of philosopher kings and queens to rule society through noble lives. Nietzsche thinks he's only speaking to the few. But again, as an apologist of Nietzsche, I want to say, I think what's really interesting here is the possibility that as time has passed, that more and more of us might be willing to peer into the abyss and to see the tragedy of this moment, and then look back at the canvas and see the opportunity that awaits. And if we were to conduct 1 million little Van Gogh experiments, we might find our way forward. And there's no guarantee, but we might find our way forward as individuals, and we might find our way forward even as a culture. And this, I think, helps us to understand a little bit of how Nietzsche describes the process of becoming active in the face of this great historical tragedy, the death of God and the empty canvas that confronts us, and the despair and all that. He says in certain places that life really only justifies itself aesthetically. Now, forget, Kierkegaard's use of the aesthetic here for a second. Hear what I think he means. And again, always a lot of room for interpretation in Nietzsche, is that what is beautiful is what justifies existence. And I want to use that in kind of, because Nietzsche was a great scholar of Greek philosophy. And so I want to use this in kind of a deeper, richer sense of the beautiful is that which inspires us. And think about that language, inspires, inspirits us, right? And what is spirit? It is breath itself. It is aliveness. You need to find the beauty and paint it on your blank canvas that inspires, it enlivens you, makes you feel more alive than you did yesterday, makes you feel more curious than you did yesterday. If you feel bored and stressed and full of despair, get out the hammer. Learn how to say no, risk the critique, peer into the abyss, and then seek out the beauty that will inspire you. We might say revitalize you, right? Re-inspire you, bring back in the spirit into your life, that which would get you up tomorrow morning, that which would give you something to say yes to. Individually, why? Well, because that's where the creative act happens. Right? That's where the creative act happens, in the place of the individual who has dared to become the artist of life, knowing that it's not about selling paintings, and knowing that it's not about followers, and knowing it's not a popularity contest, knowing that the most important thing is how alive it makes you feel. And if we conducted enough of these experiments in terms of people pursuing inspiration, and particularly, again, I want to add as an apologist for Nietzsche, a kind of a communal element that maybe he doesn't often talk about. If we did this collaboratively, it's pretty amazing when we pursue inspiration through pursuing beauty, especially in collaboration with other open-minded others, what we can generate in terms of taking us forward. And so Nietzsche has this last idea that again was problematized by some, but I want to put on the table, and that is the idea of the Übermensch, the idea of the sort of the over person, the overhuman, the beyond human. It was often translated into English as the Superman, and that was one of the ways that the Nazis appropriated this, or I would say misappropriated this, into some kind of idea of the higher type of human. It is a notion of the higher type of human, but it's not racist and it's not ethnic. I mean, Nietzsche is actually just as condemnatory of the Germans as he is of everybody else, right? But what Nietzsche's Übermensch is to me a really interesting idea of the kind of creature that can overcome itself. Now, what does that mean? Well, who have we been? We've been sheeple historically with metaphysical impulses to embrace large accounts of existence that somehow stamped our lives with some kind of imagined authority, truth. This is right, you're doing it right. Nietzsche's saying, can you be the one that writes your own story, that paints your own vision, in the time where we realize that we will likely never get that stamp? If you can be the author, and let me bring this down back into talking about morality and ethics. If you can be the author of your value structure, both in terms of what you say yes to in life, what gets you out of bed in the morning, what makes your life worth living, what gives you a good life, and in terms of the way you want to treat other people, what you're going to consider being a good person, the way in which maybe you want to live in such a way that makes more creatures like you possible, rather than more what Nietzsche calls Untermensch, undermen, mere humans, human all too human, herd animals, followers, these dangerous relics of the past. What we need is bold artists of existence. And again, I would add perhaps collaborating, right, to figure out how we're going to do this together. And I would think that it's totally consistent with this idea of the Übermensch to say this is definitely not about dominating others. Nietzsche talks about the way in which an Übermensch might catch the eye of another Übermensch, and there'd be a kind of a twinkle. And he's really down on certain things like pity. He's got some very strange raps on many things that we think of as virtue in the Christian and Judaic Christian and Islamic traditions in particular. But there's this notion that if you gather enough inspiration through making your life beautiful in the way that you want to make your life beautiful, that what you have is an energy for your own self-recreation, and it's so abundant that it does just spill out onto others. And so you walk through the world in such a way that you just are spilling out creative, mysterious life energy onto others. And it's not because you pity them, or it's not because you think you have some duty to lift them up. You just do, because you're that alive. And when you catch the eye of the other person that's that alive, you just kind of silent nod, little wink. Say, I'll see you on the dance floor of existence. I look forward to seeing your moves. Right? I'm not going to try to copy them. I might steal and appropriate. I actually think we often steal and appropriate things from each other in ways that maybe all this existential philosophy vocabulary makes it seem like we don't do. I mean, there's copying, and then there's copying, right? And then there's appropriating. I mean, check out the history of art. If you want to understand what it means to appropriate things and to then, have a will to power and a creative going beyond, do some history of art and do some history of philosophy. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants. And so, maybe in some sense, all the talk about originality and uniqueness I often think is a little overstated. With that said, it's your life. Can you become the Übermensch? Can you become what I like to call human 2.0? that creature in this moment of existence which can dare to author your own existence. And if you can, you're going to be a part of the experiment that might take us forward. No guarantees, but it might take us forward. And so this is the challenge that I wanted to leave you with. To me, it seems like the challenge. You know, we can't give up on the questions of ethics. You can't live without direction. You have to have direction and purpose in order to get out of bed in the morning and to not be overcome by existential despair and anxiety. I would highly recommend doing this in collaboration with other artists of existence. And that leads us to this sort of, you know, as Aristotle said, we are social animals. You know, all this talk of individualism is overstated, I think, to some extent in both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and in contemporary culture. And so, you know, I would take us back to, look, we need to find something to say yes to get out of bed in the morning, you know, that makes it worth getting out of bed in the morning. And we're going to do this together. And if we're going to do this in society and complex societies together, it's seemingly globally or not, right? Like we're going to do this globally or we're going to kind of wreck it, you know, and there's going to be some kind of massive retreat in civilization as we know it. We're either going to take this thing forward together or we're not. And if we're going to take it forward together, then we're going to still have to solve this other problem, this difficult, you know, problem of a kind of a set of ethical frameworks that allow us to think through our moral dilemmas in terms of how we treat each other and how best we might maybe encourage each other to become part of the solution instead of part of the problem. And so I often end this course of lectures with a kind of a strange return to something from the middle of the 20th century, but something that was really important for me when I first came across it. And so I'll be bold and leave you with this. It's a quote from a work today, a work called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And it's written by a guy named Joseph Campbell, who was an American scholar of religion and mythology. And, you know, in the higher levels of the academy, you know, people have mixed opinions about Campbell. I think at the very least, you've got to admire Campbell. He was really smart and really well educated. And yes, he might have fallen prey to trying to sort of, how shall I say it, present us with a sort of an end-all be-all account of mythology. I think that's probably even uncharitable. But he was very famous for looking at many different cultural traditions and looking for the sort of archetypally human issues that were found across these. And he generated some interesting discourse that, frankly, I think was positively influential in the form of what's called the monomyth. And the work, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which was published first in 1949, is about the heroic journey of being a human that has been represented 1,000 different ways, right, in all these different cultural tales. Now, one of the critiques of Campbell is that he reads kind of a 20th century focus on individualism back into ancient mythological literature. You know, there might be I think there's something fair in that critique. But with that said, I think there's also something still really valuable in the way that Campbell pulls from the sort of rich depths of mythology and religious texts to try to bring something forward to this moment. And his work, if you've never seen it or read it, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, man, I'd highly recommend it. And I want to offer you a quote to close out from the concluding chapter called The Hero Today. Now, admittedly, this is 1949. It's, you know, it's going to sound like kind of ancient, you know, it's going to sound old, you know, to many people, especially young people in 2020. But But again, remember, one of the things I've tried to do in this lecture series is say, take a historical perspective. It's going to really shine an interesting light on your life and on what you're up to and on the challenges of existence. Try, it's good to focus on the moment, in a lot of ways, but it's also important, I think, intellectually to try to develop historical awareness. And so in that sense, these 19th century figures that I finished up with, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and now this 20th century figure that I want to quote here, are very recent. And I quote Campbell because I think he is still speaking to a moment here. And I'm gonna change it up a little slightly, because what he says in The Hero Today, the last chapter of this 1949 work, that Hero with a Thousand Faces, he starts off with the modern hero. And to make it connect to the ideas that I've been developing here in this lecture and the last, I want to say the postmodern hero. And I really believe that that's charitably consistent with the spirit of the quote. Okay, so you can disagree with me on that if you want. So the postmodern hero, the postmodern individual who dares to heed the call and seek the mansion of that presence with whom it is our whole destiny to be atoned, cannot, indeed must not, wait for the community to cast off its slough of pride and fear and rationalized avarice and sanctified misunderstanding. Live, Nietzsche says, he's quoting Nietzsche there, live, Nietzsche says, as though the day were here. It is not society, Campbell continues, it is not society that is to guide and save the creative hero, but precisely the reverse. And so every one of us shares the supreme ordeal, carries the cross of the Redeemer, not in the bright moments of the tribe's greatest victories, but in the silences of our personal despair. Okay, I think that's a very powerful characterization of the challenge that I'm trying to leave you with. We started off with philosophy as an evolutionary experiment, and we went through Taoism, and we went through the Western tradition in its beginnings, and Socrates, a crucial figure there. And I think in some sense, right, the philosophical quest, the quest for existence, is the quest to be that hero that saves the society. Don't wait to be saved by society, Campbell's saying. That you need to be the one, and look at that kind of Kierkegaardian reference, that to carry the cross of the Redeemer. You're the Redeemer. You're not saved by the Redeemer. You're the Redeemer, right? You're going to redeem your own existence or you're not. You're going to paint your beautiful vision or you're not. And your beautiful vision will contribute to the moving forward of society or it will not. And by the way, if you don't paint it, it's got no chance of contributing to the way we move forward as a society. And so more than anything, I wish you the strength and the courage to live in this moment of history and in this moment in the here and now, and to philosophically reflect when appropriate on your lives, and to collaborate with other creative artists of existence, and to get out there on the dance floor of life and to find some joy and to move us forward. I wish you well.